Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morey, thank you for being with us remotely today. I appreciate your testimony. I feel badly for the circumstances you're in. I certainly hope your prognosis is good and that you're feeling well. I read your testimony, so I know the story, but we did not have a good audio connection for much of your opening comments. So I just want to clarify a few things for people who might not have been able to understand what you were saying. First of all, my understanding is you own your own home, and attached or as part of that home, there's an apartment, and that you rented that apartment out on a month-to-month lease to a tenant, right?
That is correct.
Right. And then at some point, because of a deterioration in your health, you decided that you really needed to have your sister move into that apartment who could help you. And so you provided the notice to your tenant that you at some point would not continue to renew the lease, and your tenant nevertheless refused to leave the apartment. Is that right?
That is correct.
And did I understand you to say that she stayed in the apartment without paying at least the full rent, maybe, I don't know if she paid any rent, for 2 years?
Close to.
Close to 2 years. She stayed in the apartment, and you couldn't do anything about that. Why?
Because housing closed. And even when I tried to open a different case because of her smoking, so more of an emergency type of hearing or filing, that was going to start the clock over again, meaning that my last filing would go away and the new filing would then take its place.
And with an eviction moratorium in place, would you be able to evict this person?
Yes. If there was no eviction moratorium in place, if I heard you correctly, yes, that is correct.
Right. If there was no eviction moratorium, then you could. If there is an eviction moratorium, then you wouldn't. Did this person seem to know that you were not in a position to be able to evict her?
Yes.
And so took advantage of that. And so let me ask you, now, having gone through this experience and knowing what you know about the government's willingness, certainly at times, to impose a ban on evictions, do you regret having rented your place out?
I don't regret it, but a guarantee of no moratorium, there would have to be more than that. I would have to feel supported and protected by my government. There would have to be protections for risk mitigation laws that don't just favor one side in order for me to ever consider renting again.
Right. We've been hearing a lot about the supply of housing. It's true. We have a shortage. And this is, to me, a very compelling story of the unintended consequence of what's meant to be helpful to tenants, but actually becomes very harmful when some people inevitably abuse this. Mr. Dunn, in your testimony, you said, and I quote, "Government actions that raise my costs ultimately impact my residents and my ability to provide affordable housing," end quote. So I assume that, like any other business, if there are higher costs imposed on you from the outside, at some point, you've got to pass that on to your customers, the renters, whether it's in higher rent or a higher security deposit or some combination thereof. If higher costs are imposed on you, are you going to have to impose those costs ultimately on renters?
Generally, that is the case.
Right.
There's a misconception that landlords are mostly big business, and as we've heard today, that over 70% of landlords are small business.
Yeah, I do want to get to a point about that.
And also those costs have to be passed on because there's such relatively small margins,
right,
like in any business. I mean, some businesses have less than 10% of a cash flow margin and up to maybe 20 or 30%. So if costs are raised by maybe even 10 or 20%, that could absolutely wipe out any profit potential.
And so it has to get passed on. Yeah. So a cost such as, higher tax or a higher maintenance cost on your building is an obvious one. But there's another kind of cost, which would be if the government imposes an eviction moratorium that has the effect that some percentage of rent is not going to be collected because people know that you have no recourse if they don't pay the rent. So most people will still continue to pay their rent on time because they know it's the right thing to do, and they will.
Right.
But there will be some percentage that will choose not to.
Right.
And so knowing that, if you're living under an eviction moratorium where the government is imposing that cost in the form of a lost revenue, don't most landlords have to pass that on in the form of a higher rent to people who are paying their rent?
The moratoriums can it can threaten the relationship between tenants and landlords. Most tenants, as you said, they pay their rent. They're responsible.
Sure.
But when you have a system that doesn't protect the other side of the partnership, and you'll often hear me use that word partnership, it's not about the tenant, it's not about the landlord, it's about the tenant-landlord partnership. And when one side of that partnership is not protected, it hurts the entire system. So when you have a moratorium in place that doesn't allow one side of the partnership to thrive, that entire system breaks down.
And the cost is going to have to be borne by people who are paying. Last point I want to make, it's come up repeatedly from witnesses, and my colleagues have made the point about increasing percentage of single-family homes, especially, that are owned by private investors. And there's a lot of people very concerned about that. I would just underscore that the people who are most able to afford the burden, the costs of ever more regulations are large corporations that can spread that out in a big legal department as opposed to the mom and pop tenant. And by the way, we tolerate the GSEs subsidizing the financing of private investors in these single-family homes. If people would prefer to have local landlords and people owning their own homes, one thing we could do is forbid the GSEs from engaging in these subsidies. I would urge my Democratic colleagues to consider that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.